Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to let everyone take another minute or two to cycle in, and then we'll get started. Awesome. I think we've got a good group. Let's kick this off. So, hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for PowerFlex's webinar today, Decarbonizing Fleets at Scale from Planning to Execution. Our speakers today are Reed Gustin, Director of Sales at PowerFlex, and Joshua Lloyd, Senior Consultant at 1898 & Co. This webinar will be recorded for PowerFlex's proprietary use and available in our event center after the webinar wraps up later today. The presentation will last about 45 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes at the end for attendee questions. The question function has been enabled for participants to submit questions throughout the presentation, and Reed and Josh will review them at the end. Thanks everyone for joining. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Reed and Josh.
Josh?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to be on the webinar with you this morning. I wanted to just introduce our company. So who's 1898 & Co? Well, we're part of Burns McDonnell, and we're the business, technology, and security consultancy division at Burns McDonnell. The name comes from when we were started. Burns McDonnell was established in 1898, and over 125 years as a company, we've been involved in much of the major infrastructure across the United States. We started doing water treatment plants. We're heavily involved in building power generation, renewable systems, including solar and also battery energy storage. We're involved in building airports, manufacturing facilities, food processing, office buildings, and heavily involved in transmission and distribution systems, electrical substations. And what that lets us do is we build off that wealth of knowledge that we've established over 125 years through all these different industries to help us really work with our clients on all of the upfront planning and business strategies, financial analysis, and data analytics for everything related to infrastructure building. And if we just go to the next slide, Reed, that fits in really nice with the electrification industry because it touches so many different portions of our industry in the United States and North America. And really, when we're looking at it, some of our capabilities that fall into that market come from doing upfront planning, which we'll talk more about in this webinar, from doing fleet analysis and charging infrastructure analysis, evaluating the financial impacts of electrification and the emissions impacts. And then when we start to move to the right in our capabilities, getting into planning and execution, what we do is our consultants at 1898 & Co work hand in hand with our engineers at Burns McDonnell to start to figure out conceptual designs and then really moving our plans into execution for detailed design, procurement, and construction. So I'll pass it over to you, Reed.
Thanks, Josh. Just for a quick background on PowerFlex, we are part of EDF Renewables North America and ultimately the EDF Group. EDF Renewables North America provides grid scale clean technology solutions. So everything front of the meter, like massive solar and wind farms. PowerFlex took all of that energy expertise and brought it to the commercial and industrial sector. So all of the work we do is behind the meter, it's on-site generation, on-site consumption. Over the years, we've developed over 440 megawatts of on-site solar, 40 megawatts of commercial battery storage, and over 15,000 charging stations. And today we've got over 31,000 chargers actually connected to and operating on the PowerFlex X platform today. So PowerFlex X is the platform that we've developed over the last several years as being a project company, also developing the software to be able to operate, control, monitor, and most importantly, optimize the performance of these different assets as the sites for our customers grow and expand over time. So diving real quickly into PowerFlex X and what it is, it's really three different systems all in one integrated platform. So we have the PowerFlex X EV charging management system, and this is used to operate all of the EV chargers that we're operating. We've got a 5-star app in the app stores. We offer full-scale functionality. So whether your sites are specifically for fleet or you're also having public or private charging, we've got a full set of features there. We have the secret sauce is our adaptive load management. This allows us to scale 10 times the amount of chargers on existing electrical infrastructure, and ultimately very flexible with fees, payment options, and different deployment sizes. Outside of the charge management software, we also, PowerFlex X is also a unified energy management system. So again, not just controlling EV chargers, but providing unified control for sites with EV charging, solar, and battery storage, all within the one platform. So then within that, you've got real-time optimization, the opportunity to participate in grid service programs. We have our proprietary edge-to-cloud architecture that is SOC 2 Type 2 certified. And we offer comprehensive performance and sustainability reporting. And so when you have a rollout of EV chargers and battery storage and solar across the multiple sites, what you ultimately need is an asset management platform to provide real-time and historical visibility into all of these assets. And so the PowerFlex X platform together, post-installation, is this a platform that's really an energy management platform that's monitoring and optimizing these assets as we go. And we recognize that that between the pre-planning work that 1898 and Josh and his team does, and the post-installation, optimization and control that PowerFlex is expert at, we offer this complementary list of services and solutions, helping you guys, the same customers, just at different points in the journey. So this is the first of a couple different webinars that we'll be doing this year to help guide you through this process. So with that, I'll pass it back to Josh to dive a little bit deeper into what 1898 and Co does.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. So as Reed mentioned on the previous slide, it really is a journey to transition a fleet to an electric future. And really, this transition, it isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, especially since this webinar is called Electrification at Scale. And to really scale up, it requires you to think through all the different details of your operation so that you can be able to implement an electric fleet successfully. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through. This is a roadmap. And one thing that we talk about is no two fleets are the same, right? You might have a fleet, you might be operating a fleet for a municipality where you've got water services, engineering, you may have pool vehicles. You could be an electric utility where you have service vehicles and bucket trucks and critical operations that are running around the clock. You might do package delivery where you're operating out of one central location and you have very known fixed routes. Or you could be food and beverage as well, where you're hub and spoking, delivering out from one point to many different endpoints. So the one thing that we have in common, though, is that there are key components that we need to think through regardless of our fleet. And this journey might change a little bit and be tailored differently in each of these points. But let's walk through some of those, and then I'll step through and go into a little bit more detail on some of these points. And it really begins with an operational assessment, right? We need to understand what kind of vehicles we have, what kind of duty cycles they're performing, and where they're operating from. Then we need to look at the technology and understand what are the right vehicles that fit the electrification use case. Are there vehicles out on the market that meet the needs that we have? And if they don't today, what's the future look like? And can we begin this process and look forward a little bit and start to see some vehicles that might arise in the future that meet our use case a little bit better. Once we understand those two things, we need to start looking at the energy. How much energy do we need for our vehicles to fuel them back up? And with that, we really want to understand the charging needs and infrastructure. And Reed's going to talk a little bit more about that around adaptive load management later. But then we're going to have impacts to our facilities as well. We might need to upgrade electrical capacity on the site. We need to figure out where on site we want to charge. We need to think about how our depots flow and function and operate today, and how electric vehicle infrastructure might change that. Or are there ways that we can seamlessly integrate it with the facility today? The utility interconnection is huge. It's so important to understand what the capacity is from the local utility, if there are any incentives available, what the make-ready infrastructure costs are, and what the utility might provide, and really just getting them engaged early so that we can help them understand what our fleet of the future looks like, what its electrical requirements are, and really start to mesh that infrastructure we're building with what the utility can provide. If we have critical operations, we might want to look at on-site backup power through mobile battery storage. Maybe if we're in an area that's really conducive to solar, maybe that becomes an option. Maybe it doesn't. It just really depends on where you're operating your fleet from, but we need to look at those considerations. And then there's the capital costs. Today, you have to have upfront cost for the infrastructure. Your vehicles might cost a little bit more, but in the light duty space, we're starting to get a little bit more towards parity. But we need to think about all those things in a programmatic way to really start to develop the phased approach over time. So let's dig into the first bullet point. What do we do in an operational assessment? Well, again, let's look at the left side of this chart. It's really that function of the vehicle, right? What is its use case? And then with its use case, what sort of range and duty cycle does it have every day? And we want to know that so that we can really select the right vehicles for electrification. And if you remember, I said this process, when we're doing it at scale, it isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. So we want to really aim at our low-hanging fruit. Maybe we have a fleet that's a municipality that has a whole mix of vehicles. Well, maybe it's good to start with some of those light-duty vehicles, right, that we know that maybe aren't heavily used. Maybe there are some that are heavily used that are a good candidate from a savings perspective. Maybe we have a location in our fleet, if we're running more of a fixed known route, maybe there are some locations across a national footprint that make more sense than others because we're more conducive to electrification in that point. Maybe there's more incentives from the utility. So maybe the operating conditions and weather are a little bit better at that location. So, we really want to start thinking about picking those electric vehicles that work for our fleet. Then it comes into the right-hand side is where do they park, right? Because we need to know how we're going to charge them. And what we want to do is we want to look for long dwell time locations if we can, so that we can install, infrastructure that has a slower peak charging rate. Maybe we have larger vehicles in our fleet. Maybe we need to have more of a larger DC fast charging depot built, but that's what we're going to start to understand in this task. So if we move to the next slide, we build the energy requirements off the operational assessment, knowing the vehicle types, use cases, duty cycles, dwell times. And then what we can start to do is we can start to look at, how long different infrastructure is going to take to charge, or how often do the vehicles need to charge a week. And this example is a municipality that we work for in a warmer climate, and we have 30 different departments across the y-axis of the graph. And really, for this fleet, level 2 charging fit really well. We had 8-9 hours of dwell time every night for pretty much all the vehicles. And really, most of the vehicles across those departments were able to charge once per week, with some needing a little bit more. But level 2 was really a good fit. And you can see a majority here in this box and whisker chart are falling into that 1.5 to 3 hours range of charging, with some outliers, of course, right, with vehicles that might be used a little bit more. So this is important because this sets the stage for the infrastructure deployment, which I'll talk about in some future slides. But if we drop down, what about the vehicles, right? in terms of total cost of ownership. So if we go to the next slide, Reed, we'll talk about that. Thank you. Total cost of ownership, right? So we can start to compare all the different vehicle types and classes together for an electric vehicle and for an ICE vehicle. And you can see here, really in terms of maintenance and fueling in this case, with the assumptions listed below the graph on the left, the EV has a 6.5-year payback over a 10-year life cycle of the vehicle. So even though we're spending a little bit more upfront on that capital investment in the vehicle, we're going to save that over the life of the vehicle. And this is a really good way to start to look at what candidates are right for electrification. And we see these benefits improving over time too, as that vehicle price closes in to parity. So if we move on to the next slide, another really important aspect is a lot of our clients are looking at how can we reduce our emissions of our fleet. Some cities have targets that they've got where they want to decarbonize and reduce and be net zero maybe by 2050, maybe completely eliminate the use of gas by 2050 or beyond. So what we're trying to help our clients understand here is, again, we're doing a marathon, not a sprint. So let's look at the vehicle classes where we get the most value out of emissions. Some use cases just aren't ready for electrification yet, but if we can focus on the use cases that are, for example, our biggest contributor to getting emissions reduction here is our first 5 vehicle classes with light duty pickup trucks and some step vans. And, just with those first 5 vehicle classes, we can get in the realm of 50 to 60% emissions reduction. And then, as we move out into the top 10, we're really down 90% in our overall emissions of the fleet. So here we can just really push out some of those more challenging, maybe difficult vehicles where we're not getting as much emissions benefit, and transition those later in the plan for electrification. And that segues into the next point we want to talk about is our vehicle transition plan, right? So we just need to understand how are we replacing these vehicles, right? So when we look at this, are we doing it through attrition, through age? So as we get to the end of the life, we're looking to replace those vehicles. What year will those vehicles come up, and what will be in that what mix of vehicles will we have in that time period? Or are we aiming at a greenhouse gas emission reduction target, which might change what this vehicle purchase schedule looks like? And really what we found with most of our clients is, we're trying to get the most out of these assets, run them through their full life, and then try and replace them at the end of their life. And that's what this chart really is showing here. This was produced a few years back, and we're just showing the number of transitions, vehicles that are changed every year out to 2030, and then we have some beyond 2030. And what we can do is we can start to line up the infrastructure that we want to build in a programmatic way that lets us electrify these vehicles over time. And I think we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about that expansion. So if we're aiming, this is always the question that we get. What do we do? Do we build the infrastructure first, or do we get the vehicles first? Now, we know some folks that have gotten vehicles and they're in a position where, they've had to piecemeal together infrastructure deployments. So they might have some different chargers. They might have some different charge management software providers. And really, we've seen with our clients that, that happens more on a pilot stage, and you get into a lot of complexities, and reliability is not great. Maintenance is high on the chargers. And then really, you might not be happy with that software selection, or you might have different vendors. So we really want to talk about, and Reed's going to go over some of this as well, as unifying under one platform, doing this in a scalable way. So when we do this, we'll look at a target year for 2030. Maybe we'll pick one site and we'll say this is where we're going to build out infrastructure first. And we'll use that vehicle transition plan to help us quantify, and the operations assessment and the energy requirements to quantify when we're building infrastructure and where we're building infrastructure. And what we can do is if we know, maybe we'll have 10 vehicles at a site by a certain period, and then we know we'll do another 10 vehicles later in that time frame. Well, we can start to build out make-ready infrastructure, make sure we've got conduit sizes that are appropriate. We can do stub outs so that we can come in later and expand the infrastructure. We can look at doing smaller electrical capacity and upgrading it later, or building all of the capacity at once. So we bring in those considerations. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing that this is one site that we did for Maricopa County. And, we had so many charges that were going to be phase one, make ready for phase two. And the little table here is showing 15 sites that we prioritized for them, and what the costs are at each of those sites. And really, we're starting at this point to lay out conceptual design and engineering. So looking at electrical one lines, doing conceptual designs for layouts. And this really helps us form our basis of how do we want to trench? How much do we think this is going to cost in, switchboards and transformers and conduit trenching, electrical wire, labor. We build those costs up to really start to get a good budgetary cost. And at this point too, some things we're looking at is one, the importance of utility coordination, making sure the utility's ready to bring the make ready in and the power to the site, but also cost savings we might be able to leverage from doing a little bit of reduced electrical capacity and managing the charging of those vehicles over a larger time window through adaptive load management. And Reed, I'm going to pass it over to you now. I think this is a good time to bring up an example of how PowerFlex does that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just jump into our online dashboard. So this is Access. This is where our customers, our customer success team, anyone doing O&M or wanting to monitor real-time or historical data on a site, this is where you go to do that. And what we're looking at here is just a site that has solar and battery storage and EV charging. This is a 7-day look back. We call it a multi-tech historian. And what I'll do is I'll actually just zoom in on one particular day. So we'll look at yesterday. And this is in San Diego. And I'll just kind of walk through a little bit about what's going on here. So you can see the middle line is our facility load profile. We're monitoring the facility load using our on-site controller. The yellow line is the solar production. So it's a nice sunny day in San Diego. And the blue line is our EV charging load profile. So most of these vehicles all plug in at the same time, and there's 61 level 2 chargers at the site. What you don't see is a big spike in the blue line. With our adaptive load management, we know how long these vehicles are going to be parked for and how much energy they need. And with those two pieces of information added into the algorithm, we're able to say, okay, let's charge all of these vehicles a little bit slower, but over the course of how long they're parked. So at the end of the day, the vehicle, or at the end of the parking session, vehicle has the battery state of charge they need. While we met some of the energy optimization strategies for the facilities, such as reducing the overall load for the facility and energy arbitrage. And so because this site also has a battery storage on it, I'll just click on our battery state of charge, and you can see that we're start filling up the battery at about the same time that the sun starts shining. And we fill up the battery all day. And then the gray period here is 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. This is where you have our peak time of use pricing in California. And so we discharge the battery, and you can see the battery state of charge line then going down during that period. Like I said, with an ultimate goal of reducing the amount of power that we pull from the utility during that peak pricing time. So if I get rid of the battery, solar, and EV charging, and we just look at the net load, now you can kind of see the result where we have still our original facility load profile. And now after having solar, battery, and EV charging operating on this site, we went from original peak load of about 310 kilowatts down to 130 kilowatts. And everything, all of the difference between the top line and bottom line is really savings. That's energy that we didn't consume from the utility yesterday. So just to give kind of a visual representation of how we're reacting in real time, taking in data from the edge or from the site, and ultimately, managing the energy consumption for the facility. I'll also just show we do have this real-time power flow, which I think is another great visual representation of kind of what we're doing on site, where we're controlling the flow of electrons, making sure they go where they need to go when. And so you can see right now the sun's just coming up, and we're not yet generating as much power as the facility needs. And so we are pulling from the grid right now. But over the course of the day, when the sun hits its peak, this kind of shifts all around. So it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, thanks, Reed. Just to close out my slide, I think something really important that Reed showed there too is that utility rates can be really complex. And, looking at just charges for a kilowatt hour or a demand charge that might be at your site, we really want to try and think about those things when we're deploying the infrastructure as well, right? So whatever we can do when we're building out, our financial business case and the cost of charges, vehicles, total cost of ownership is thinking about, can we reduce some of those demand charges, if any, as well? And having, ALM in place can help us understand and manage that. So many different pieces to look at. But really, that closes some of the steps I wanted to walk through, Reed. So if you want to take over and walk through, the PowerFlex side, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So as you heard from Josh, there's a lot that goes into planning and preparing for a successful fleet electrification journey. Want to talk now about things that things that you may not have thought about, or the things that you may not know are going to be important to you as you go from your initial phase one, installation of 2 to 4 chargers, or enough for electrifying 2% of your fleet to 10 or 15% of your fleet and needing 40 chargers. And so some of the things that we're going to cover now are, when you're doing these site expansions and you have capacity constraints, what are the different types of load management that you may want to evaluate. We'll talk about real-time monitoring and control that you may want as you, again, have EV charging across multiple sites, for example, and wanting to have one place to see all of that. And then having, again, that real-time reporting and our a public API access for taking all of this data and sharing it with people that need it. So we'll dive in. So starting off, you have more chargers and the need for load management, right? So there's a few types of load management that you may hear about, or that different companies are pitching that they have. In some cases, you may not even need load management. So the standard approach for EV charging without load management is, I guess, okay when you have a small site, maybe 1 to 5 chargers, and you have enough electrical capacity where it doesn't need to be split or slowed down. Typically, some of you on the call maybe at this point where you have a low number of drivers, a low number of electric vehicles, and you don't yet need the load management. But if you keep going on the same approach of EV charging without load management, you will likely need a utility upgrade as you electrify more vehicles. Circuit sharing is a type of load management that a lot of software providers use. And when you have circuit sharing, what happens is the more vehicles that get plugged into the same amount of electrical infrastructure, the same capacity doesn't increase. And so you have to kind of divide the amount of power by the amount of available power by the amount of vehicles that are plugged in. What this results in is the last vehicle to plug in gets a very slow charge. And if their dwell time isn't long enough, then they're not going to have the power that they need by the time they need to leave. The next one here on the right is our adaptive load management. This is our patented EV charging software. And ultimately, this uses the National Electric Code 62542, which allows us to use our load management to oversubscribe at the panel and at the panel level. And ultimately, we can deploy 6 to 10 times the amount of chargers without needing a service upgrade, because we have our on-site controller, because our load management is living there on site and controlling chargers via the software instead of via electrical code. Some of the benefits of having the load management is that we can now get projects installed faster. We can utilize existing panels, different panels across the same property, and to ultimately share the existing infrastructure. And when you don't need to get the service upgrade, depending on where you are, service upgrades could take anywhere from 18 to 24 months. So when you can alleviate that pain point, it'll be beneficial for everybody. So when you think about how this looks at in the numbers, when you have a 800 amp capacity, you may only be able to put in 18 chargers without needing to go to the utility for a service upgrade. With the PowerFlex's adaptive load management, you could put in 138 chargers. And the way that we If every charger were to be plugged in at once, then we would derate them to about 8 amps per charger in order to fulfill the needs. But what's unique is everyone doesn't plug in at the same time. And so we can be a little bit more intelligent with operations. So again, getting back from the CapEx perspective, we can get chargers installed faster and less expensive because we don't need to do the expansions on the infrastructure. But if we look at how this works, operationally, again, on the left, you have this equal share charging, whereas vehicle 3 and vehicle 4 pull up, they get quite a slow charge. On the right, with adaptive load management, you'll see vehicle 1 pulls up and they're going to be here all day. And if vehicle 2 comes in and they're only here for a short period of time, same thing for vehicle 3. Now the intelligence in our software can automatically derate the amount of power going to vehicle 1 so that we can get vehicle 2 and vehicle 3 charged, and then ramp it back up for vehicle 1. And so what happens is at the end of the day, all of the vehicles get the charge that they need by the time they need to leave, while also maintaining the electrical load targets. So it's a kind of a win-win for everybody. Next, we'll talk about real-time monitoring and control. So as you expand your fleet from, again, 2 vehicles to 20 to 100, or from one site to multiple sites, you want to have a single place to be able to monitor your portfolio of assets, the health of the chargers. Are there any that are faulted or broken? Being able to see all of the charging activity from one single dashboard and be able to zoom out from a portfolio view all the way into really close to a single session with just a couple of clicks is something that you'll be looking for, and something that PowerFlex X provides. Then you think about remote control, like if a charger breaks, or if a charging session is not working, you don't want to have to call somebody to try to remotely diagnose it. You'll want the ability to just log into your dashboard and start, stop, or reset a charger. Or maybe there may be an instance where you want to prioritize a specific charger. Maybe there's a state of emergency and you say, hey, I need these chargers to get full power because this fleet needs to get turned around quick. Or let's say you want to download OCPP messages or update firmware. These are all functionalities that PowerFlex has developed in our portal because of the fleet customers that we work with and requests that have came from them, giving the ability to have more control at the site of the chargers. Another thing that you may want, and we talked about adaptive load management and doing charging based on the driver needs and the site capacity constraints. But there's another way to think about charging when you take into consideration, let's say, time of use schedules or participating in a demand response event, right? And so we've created these smart charging functionality where you can either do it based on a site-wide charging schedule, reducing the total allowable power draw for a site, or at a station level. An example of this is we'll go back to California when you have super off-peak pricing from 10 p.m. till 4 a.m. Well, if the fleet all comes in at 5 p.m. and you want to reduce the cost of the charging, and you know that those vehicles aren't leaving till 6 or 7 in the morning, you can create a charging schedule to charge very slowly from 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. And then from 10 p.m. till 4 a.m., when the cost of that power is very low, we can optimize the charging sessions and ramp them up during that time. You have now a more cost-effective charging solution, something that you may not think about when you only have 2 vehicles or 2 to 4 chargers when it's such a small percentage of your fleet is electric. Another thing is real-time notifications and alerts. So depending on the type of fleet that you're operating, again, maybe it's last mile delivery and vehicles need to leave at a very specific time in the morning. And we're bringing in your schedules via our telematics integrations, maybe not. There's lots of different types of alerts that we can set up to come out to our fleet operators. They can be configured to come out via text message or email or in the app, and there's actionable and not actionable alerts. So this is just an example saying, hey, this vehicle is supposed to leave supposed to be at 85% state of charge and leave at I don't know, 10:51. But it's not going to be at that state of charge. So do we need to extend the charging for a couple minutes, or do you want to leave it on time, but a smaller state of charge? And just as an example, as when you have multiple sites, hundreds of vehicles, lots of stuff moving around, being able to get these alerts coming in directly has proven very beneficial just for overall operations. And then we've got some additional, you want additional visibility. What you realize is with telematics, for example, your fleet operators are spending a majority of their time in the telematics platform monitoring the health of the fleet. And only a small percentage of your vehicles are electric, but you want to be able to pull in the charging session data into your telematics dashboard, or maybe vice versa. We want to pull in vehicle data that you have from telematics into your charging session dashboard. And so with our public API and some of the integrations, we've been able to do that. And so this is an example of a depot manager view where you have more information about what's going on with the charging because of this integration and the data we're pulling in from the vehicle telematics. You have things like charging location, the state of charge, and the range for the vehicle that we're pulling. And with that data, we're able to, again, give some additional visibility. So you can see in your depot, if you have vehicles that are finished charging and vehicles that are in the depot and need to be plugged in, that could be a visual cue to go in and swap those cars around. So the last thing to talk about is reporting and APIs. So again, as there's more electricity being charged by your fleet, and that's all, again, expense that needs to be tracked. And as you have different departments that those expenses need to be tracked too, or when you're trying to claim LCFS credits, or trying to measure your emissions reductions for different scopes, reporting is going to be extremely important. And not only having access to data, but having that data be presented to you in an intuitive way. And so as you think about reporting, like I said, there's session details that you may need to submit to the utility to claim your incentives. Or if you're collecting revenue at a site, you want to be able to align the revenue that you're collecting with the reimbursements, or maybe you need to match those revenues to specific departments. The reporting capabilities within PowerFlex are top notch and very intuitive. You can get to whatever you need to find within just a couple of clicks. As you think about real-time operation, there's a our event-driven architecture is I would say better because we're not just setting a strategy and forgetting about it. What we're seeing here is that we have our edge optimization. This means we have an on-site controller that's connecting to EV chargers, it's connecting to battery storage and solar panels, and it's collecting real-time data from all of those assets. And there's some optimization that's in some software that lives in the on-site controller that's reacting to this data as it's coming in. But at the same time, we're sending all of that data up into the cloud. And in the cloud, we also have our API that's pulling in third-party data. So you can see on the right side of the tab here, we're pulling in fleet management data, that state of charge and longitude and latitude from our telematics partners like Geotab and Samsara. There's energy and demand rates from companies like Genability or weather channel data, so we can forecast and predict what the weather is going to be and then operate the assets accordingly. Or maybe emissions, like real-time is marginal emissions data, so that we can charge vehicles when the electrons are the cleanest and the greenest from the grid. Right, so there's all this data that we're pulling in, and when you combine that with the real-time charging session data from the edge, we create a forecast. And every 5 minutes, we're creating a new forecast based on all of the chargers that are operating at a site, or every time a new charging session plugs in. And basically what this means is that we're not setting it and forgetting it, but we're reacting to real-time conditions and optimizing based on what strategies are most important for you. So that's getting back to what I showed, that's reducing your energy costs, that's optimizing, doing demand charge reduction, that's participating in grid service events, things like that. And then scheduling. So we have, as I mentioned, we have our public API. We're just talking about it. Within our public API, it's not only us pulling in data to help influence our optimization strategies, but from a fleet perspective, we can use our public API to connect to your routing and scheduling tool. You can upload, add new drivers and vehicles so that we can track sessions to drivers and vehicles. We can export session reports. All of the data that's available within our online dashboard it will be available via the public API. It's something that we're constantly adding to. So what's next? Once you, maybe you've already got to phase one, maybe you're thinking about phase one implementation of EV charging, but our goal is to have you not just think about a single site, but think about the future. Think about what it's going to look like when you get to 50 and 100% of an electric fleet, when you don't just have a single site, when you're thinking about make ready for the single site. But when you start to have multiple sites and you start to have, what does it look like? What are your goals and for monitoring and asset management? Do you need to find somebody for operations and maintenance? Do you want to participate in demand response programs and market participation and drive additional revenue? And then, as your load increases, as you go from 2 to 20 to 200 EV chargers at a site, the energy costs are really expensive. So when you start to think about how can I add solar and battery storage to these sites and utilize and harness the power of the sun, and then take that multi-tech site and treat it as a virtual power plant again to respond and participate with the grid in more ways. So just be a little bit more forward thinking about the grander picture, and what you need to do is find the platform that delivers the most valuable or the most value for you. So look for real-time portfolio level visibility, and PowerFlex X gives you that. You want to choose a platform that gives you seamless interoperability. And the PowerFlex X platform is built on open standards. When you have, or if you plan to have solar and battery storage and EV charging, the best path forward is truly co-optimization between these assets, treating them all as one, not three separate pieces of infrastructure. And having accurate and automated reporting is extremely important for the ongoing monitoring and monitoring the health of your systems. So with that, we're 2 minutes early, but we'll open up for questions. Thank you so much for everyone sitting in. Annie?
Hi there. Questions. Let's see. Open this up. What's the best way to prepare for a renewable energy project?
Josh, you want to start?
Yeah, I think I will. So I think it's really, understanding why you're doing the renewable energy project, right? What are the drivers that are causing that, right? Because it really comes down to where you are in the country, whether it's going to make economic sense or not. And what I mean is some locations have a really low cost of energy, right? And maybe it's a location that also doesn't get a lot of sun. So, you need to think about that. If you're in an area that has a higher cost of energy and, a lot of sun, that's what you want to consider. And then you need to look at the rates that are involved as well. What's the interconnection process like? So for example, we know of a client that installed a pretty decent sized solar system on one of their facilities, and the wholesale rate they were getting for the cost of energy was really, really low, and they were using a lot of demand on edge times where, the early morning and the late afternoon where the sun wasn't shining, and they didn't have a battery system coupled with it. So I would be looking at that, looking at your load profiles of your facility, understanding your rates, your interconnection process. And I think that all just comes down to your end goal of what are you trying to achieve? And, are you looking to be more on the sustainability side, or do you still need to really have economics drivers involved? And there might be other factors too of what sort of incentives or funding sources you're using, whether or not the project makes sense or not. Reed, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about. So I would say bring in the experts, right? Depending on where you're at in your journey, there's we don't expect uh, we don't expect you as the property owner to be an expert in renewable energy infrastructure, project management, like the order of operations, which is going to be most beneficial to you, and how you should go through this journey. Um, Josh and his team, PowerFlex and our team, we have the ability to analyze a portfolio, prioritize a list of sites, look at all of the different factors. Again, what incentives are available? Incentives are a huge factor. What tax credits are you eligible for? There's a lot of things that are going to make it pencil or not. And so then it comes down to, like Josh said, what's the reason? Is it a sustainability goals that are driving this, or is it a financial goals?
Great. Next question is, when evaluating the total cost of ownership for an EV compared to ICE, I noticed in the slide a flat dollar per kilowatt hour was used. Do you also take into account the cost to install the charging infrastructure for your new electric fleet and the potential demand charges associated with charging operations?
Yes, we do. So many times in the example I showed, what we wanted to start is looking at a, more of an apples to apples comparison of the vehicles on their own right in that cost of ownership. Because a lot of the times with your existing fueling infrastructure, you're not baking in the fueling cost into a gasoline vehicle when you buy it, right? So, yes, we come back and we look at that. How much does it add on top of that to build the infrastructure per port? And that is another consideration. So we look at it both ways. In terms of demand charges, sometimes what we'll do is, yes, we'll look at that, but we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the daily profile, right? So if we might be able to fit charging in underneath the existing peak demand, right? If the facility peaks early morning or late afternoon, maybe we're charging later in the day and we're still under that demand, charge cost. And then we can look at, like a volumetric cost. Maybe we're a lot lower. Maybe we're like 5 cents or 7 cents a kilowatt hour. But yeah, that example is more of a baked cost of X cents per kilowatt hour that we did, for a specific client where we knew what their cost of energy was. And we came back later and they had some other funding sources for charging infrastructure and things as well, that we just wanted to get that comparison vehicle to vehicle first. Yeah, good question though. Thank you.
Next question is, what have been some of the biggest challenges to, one, renewable energy, solar/battery, and two, fleet electrification? So can we talk about some challenges that both of you have encountered?
I would say from the fleet electrification perspective, it's the when companies are making their, I call it phase one, your first time electrifying, your first time putting in chargers, and you don't initially consult with experts, and you don't take this approach of analyzing what's available and doing the, I don't know, step one or step two, Josh, in your path, which is like the technology evaluation. Um, if you're not thinking ahead and you're not thinking big picture, you're likely to select a service provider that may be like the lowest cost, or that maybe just the first person that comes to you, and they may not have all the features and functionalities that you want. Um, and so I think that, like, what I'm seeing is a lot of people that made this mistakes during phase one, and now we're going back and fixing mistakes. So I think, like, a challenge from my perspective, that's the biggest thing, is how can you get the buyers to think bigger picture and think beyond their first site in the beginning.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Reed mentioned there. And, to add to that, some of the things that we've seen is, right, perception versus reality. That first step I had is, and what I mean by that is, you might have trying to get telematics data and look at your vehicle use cases. And what that might be is a lot different from what you hear from your drivers. Like we always hear about how far a lot of vehicles drive, but when we look at it in reality, there's really not that many peak days. So electrification does make sense for a lot of use cases from that perspective. So one, that operation assessment, characterizing your fleet. And then with that, as part of that journey, I didn't mention this, but there's so many stakeholders, right? So you've got fleet involved, people managing and maintaining and buying the vehicles. Facilities are involved because now you're looking at how the facility changes. You've got the end users involved in the vehicles. And what we try and do is just educate everybody through these processes. And I think that as an organization too, you need to find a champion for electrification, right? So you might have a consultant and a partner like 1898 and PowerFlex helping you, and we can give you an army with all the information you need, but there needs to be a champion too internally that can drive a lot of that change that's going to happen. And I think that if you're not having a good plan laid out at the beginning, I think you become more susceptible to, like Reed was mentioning, is piecemealing the system together. And then now you're coming back and spending money again and doing rework. And you might also have, uh, a bad experience of that where electrification can work, but a poor implementation might sour a lot of your stakeholders as well. So, yeah.
I think one last thing that I'd want to add is, these technologies that we're talking about are still relatively new, in the grander scheme of things. And so when you're talking about having all these different parties and organizations and things that need to sync up in order for a very complex project to get to the point of commercial operation, like there's a lot. And what I realized is that especially when dealing with utilities, like you want to bring together, have as early and often communication with your local utility, especially when you're doing a multi-technology project, because the EV charging group within the utility may not communicate with the solar group. They may not know about the interconnection that you're waiting on, right? So having constant and like frequent communication with the utility partners in your territory, and when you've got properties that span across multiple utility territories, you start to get really complex with requirements. So I think that's definitely a big challenge. And PowerFlex, I mean, we've got a fully staffed team that's always monitoring the different incentives and the policy, how things are changing, because things are changing really fast.
What are your suggestions / best practices to future-proof fleet charging infrastructure, given the constant technology advances as it relates to vehicle and charging hardware?
Josh, I'll let you go, but I'll start with saying open standards. So work. I mean, you should be selecting in your procurement process providers that are focused on open standards, because then you'll have the ability to make changes, select different hardware, different chargers down the line, and keep working with the same software provider. Yeah.
Yeah, interoperability, is really, really key, and that's a really, really good suggestion. And then I would look at also, you know, think about that back to that adaptive load management, right? A lot of times, what we suggest for our clients is that, hey, if we're going to install a level 2, let's install a port that has a higher amperage, right? And maybe we don't need maybe that vehicle doesn't need all of that today, but the cost differential now at the point of install really isn't that much, especially if you optimize some of the electrical infrastructure and leave yourself space to upgrade it in the future if you need more capacity. But yeah, so you can install a little bit of bigger of a level 2, use adaptive load management to reduce that demand that you don't need, and then unlock it as you need later. I like level 2 charging right now for a lot of operations. If you've got a window overnight, it's cheaper to install. It's pretty easy to maintain, easy to manage, as long as you're evaluating it and making sure it meets all of the right interoperability standards that lets you manage, control, or move it, to different systems later. So that's important. And then two, like vehicles technology is changing as well. But I think if you look at your operations, right, even though maybe battery sizes are getting bigger, maybe you don't need that. Maybe you can optimize around what exists today, and then you can build the infrastructure to match today. And really, if that meets your needs, that's great. Some of the other things we looked at too is, for DC fast charging is building hubs. So if you've got a really heavily utilized site, maybe you just build a few fast charging, spots in one, in a location, and you don't overinvest in that infrastructure. You just sort of build it at specific locations, and test that out because, yeah, you technology is changing and that unit might not meet needs in 6 to 8 years. So it just comes down to, in my opinion, just a really good understanding of the use case and the operations and trying to, right size that infrastructure at this point. And, whatever you can build and upsize a little bit today, maybe it costs a little bit more today, you'll save, in the future as well. So some suggestions I have.
Great answers. Those were all of the questions that we received. So happy to give everybody a little bit of time back in their day. Reed, Josh, thank you again for your participation and your expertise. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, we're going to be distributing the materials, both the recording and the presentation, a little bit later today. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks again.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks,
Thank
Josh.
you. Thanks all.